All right, and we are back with the second part of our discussion on science, religion, and truth, and the final installment of the week one unit of lectures. I will remind you, of course, we do have the Does God Exist lecture that will be available, but it will be recommended. It will not be required. So if you wanted to watch that, you're welcome to do so, but you don't have to. So basically, we left off talking about science and religion and how they are two different modes of approaching truth. So there are two kinds of basic understandings of truth, and this is very generally speaking. So this is not like deep philosophy. Of course, everything is always more complicated, but in broad strokes, there is truth that is found in cold, hard facts, brute facts. You know, that this table exists, that it's wood. And then there's truth that comes from something that is beyond factual. Okay, so and I would argue something that cannot be empirically adjudicated. So while we can assess that the table is hard, we've already talked about how we can't assess through empirical data whether the table is good. Is it a good table? We can't make value judgments. But further, the way that we're making these judgments, when we do make them, are reliant upon the same strata of inquiry into the truth that philosophically uphold science. So we talked about how science has philosophical presuppositions that it can itself prove. For example, that we can know things. Well, the same strata of adjudication is used in religion as well, and this is what we call reason or logic. That there is a rational order to things. Rational comes from the Latin word ratio. It's where we get the word ratio. It's really difficult to translate. It can mean structure, it can mean principle, it can mean reason. So basically the idea is that the world is structured according to rules of logic. Now the problem comes in when we realize that logic cannot be materially proven. You don't have an instance of a logical empirical expression. You can't look at the law of non-contradiction. For example, the law of non-contradiction being that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. This table cannot be a table and not a table at the same time. This is the law of non-contradiction, one of the three fundamental rules of classical logic. And so, while we can look at examples, you know, Aristotle says this, we can look at examples of this law, we can't actually prove the law according to empirical data, because there's no empirical instance of it. It's similar to the number 17, for example, or numbers generally. But so if I came up to you and I said, give me 17, you would naturally ask, 17 what? Now, if I were to persist and say, like, no, I want the number 17, you would say, like, oh, I can give you 17 handshakes, I can give you 17 pieces of paper, I can give you 17 coconuts. And I say, no, I don't want those things. I want 17. Well, the reality is that 17 is not a material reality. It's a mental reality. It's actually accurate in assessing how many coconuts one has. But 17 coconuts is no more 17 itself than this lecture that you're seeing is my actual face. It's an expression of a mental reality. This gets us to the concept of truth. What is truth? Well, first of all, it's important to note that truth is such a fundamental concept to our reality that it's difficult to think about it. It's kind of like consciousness. Consciousness, which is you being self-aware and able to think about yourself and others, like that special trait that rational beings like humans have. It's something that you experience all the time, and it's the only way you experience things, and yet you don't quite know how to talk about what it actually is. What does it mean to be conscious? Truth is similar. And so the question, what is truth, is kind of an interesting question. Now, the reason I have that in quotes is because for you Bible scholars out there, you already knew it, but this is the question that Pilate asked Jesus before in the Gospel of John, before he sent him to the cross. What is truth? Well, it's a fair question. Many answers have been given. Augustine, representing the classical tradition that we're using to kind of, given that it's a predominant philosophical and theological tradition of the Christian intellectual world, Augustine says truth is whatever exists. It's similar to saying truth is. So it's kind of like asking, well, what is being? Well, being is whatever is the case. You can't give a definition of being like you can give a definition of what a light bulb is, or what even an idea is, or a number. Being is its own definition. So while light bulbs and cars and such have definitions, parts that we can jumble together with words to make an accurate claim about a car, being itself is a definition. It is what is. So, and this is of course based in the tradition that we were talking about when we were talking about God. Truth is a transcendental. The transcendentals being truth, unity, goodness, and beauty. Well, what the tradition claims is that these are all being under different descriptions. Okay? So this is when we talked about to be is good. To be is to be. And so whatever is must be true. You can't have something that is and is false. Now you might say to me like, well, no, but a lie. What about a lie? That is and it's false. Not exactly. And this is really an interesting and fun bit of logic. So if a lie is told, it is expressing a falsehood because it's expressing something that is not the case. But secondly, it's still a true thing because it has being. That is to say, it's still true that someone is telling a lie. That is still something that is the case. So even if we talk about falsehoods as a category of speech, we can't talk about falsehoods as actually existing. Not in the sense that it exists in the being or essence of anything. This table can't be false and still be here. Now I can make false claims about the table, but the table itself cannot be false because the table is. The table has being. And so we are said to know the truth when we have properly and assessed and authentically adjudicated whatever is actually the case. Okay? So when our judgment aligns with reality, then we have knowledge of the truth, because the truth is reality. Now, that's the classical understanding of truth. That's the understanding of truth that you're going to get from people like Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Al-Ghazali, great philosophers of, you know, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Jewish tradition, that share in this notion of classical philosophy and theology, classical theism, as we've been talking about. That is not the only account of truth out there. There are some, I guess like I got a little messed up on the PowerPoint there, but there are some that would claim that truth is something of an illusion, and that's not quite right. That's not totally fair. And I don't want to sacrifice accuracy. It's kind of funny, huh? For understandability. But what these people are saying, and this is an old view. You might hear that relativism goes like only back so far, that it's a modern concept. It's not. This goes back all the way to Plato. In Plato's dialogue, Protagoras, Socrates is questioning Protagoras because Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things. Things are only true because man says they're true. Now, what does Protagoras mean? Well, truth doesn't actually exist as if it's something out there. It's not the actual expression of reality. Rather, truth is something, truth is simply an interpretation of whatever's happening, constructed, built, produced by social processes. Truth isn't something you go out and find out there. Truth is something you project onto the world. This is particularly popular with philosophers and thinkers like Michel Foucault or Deleuze, people who understand truth as a kind of power play. And so the basic idea of relativism, which is a very popular view among a lot of people these days, is that all truth is really relative to subjects, worldviews, cultures, societies. Basically, that there is no such thing as absolute truth. So something can be true for you, or true for me, but it's not necessarily true in the actual sense. And this comes up in religion all the time. It comes up in morality as well. So that is your truth. This is my truth. They might be completely contradictory of each other. I might believe this table is here, and you might believe it's not. And that's your truth, and that's my truth. Now, generally speaking, this does not happen with questions about tables. And science would be extremely helpful here in adjudicating whether or not this table is actually here. The rub comes in when we start talking about certain kinds of ideals, like truth itself, or justice, or goodness. What does it mean to be good? Do not all cultures have different notions of goodness? Do not all cultures have different notions of what it means to do the right thing? This is particularly what we call moral relativism. So relativism says there are no absolute truths. There is no thing there's no idea, there's no reality that is true in all circumstances at all times, no matter what. All truth is an expression of human social minds agreeing on something, basically. It doesn't have any truth in the world, it's just something we all agree on. You know, most people would say, like, I mean, aside from science. So we agree on the rules of logic. We agree on numbers. We agree, in the moral case, that it's a bad thing to, you know, murder infants, or it's a bad thing to lie, or it's a bad thing to cheat on a test, or not do your readings. But that these are all relative to societies. You know, whether it's a truth about how a chair can exist or not exist, or about whether or not I should not steal something from a friend. These are all basically moral constructs that govern society through underlying contracts of agreement. So truth is not something that really exists out there, but rather is a concept that we use to order our realities in ways that putatively are check the time here, advantageous for our survival as a species. Now, I'm going to level with you. I think this is a completely illogical view. And I know a lot of you probably hold it. And every time I teach classes, I always have a good number of people who are relativists, especially moral relativists. They believe that scientific truths or things proven by science must be true, but anything else is not going to work. And I agree with that to the extent that science can't disprove or prove moral relativism or any kind of relativism, because again, that would be a value judgment. And I agree to the extent that, yeah, if we're going to if we can only trust what's empirical data, if we can only trust what science can prove, then sure, we can't really trust rules like logic or reason or morality. The problem is, as we've discussed, and I would stand by this critique, science uses logic. Science cannot prove, as we already talked about, the law of non-contradiction. That's a mental reality. But science uses that law all the time. Because if every time you were looking at an electron, it could also not be an electron, science wouldn't get very far. And so logic seems to be, while not material or empirical in its reality, something that is necessary for knowledge of a true state of affairs. Now, here's where it gets a little strange for those relativists. And this is why I think moral or any kind of relativism is basically illogical. If we claim, so think about this statement for a second, there is no such thing as absolute truth. Do you see it? There's something wrong with that statement. There is no such thing as absolute truth. We don't even have to have the absolute in there. There's no such thing as truth. Well, what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is, if that statement is false, then it is false that there's no such thing as truth, which means it would be true that truth is a falsehood, thus producing the state of a true case, a true state of affairs. If I say there is no such thing as absolute truth, that is not only an absolute statement, because I'm saying no truth exists anywhere at any time, but it's a truth claim. I'm saying reality is such that truth does not exist. Well, if I'm going to admit that truth doesn't exist, I also have to admit that my statement just now about truth isn't true. The language fails, and thus the claim collapses under its own weight. You can't say there's no such thing as truth, because if that is a true statement, then you have contradicted yourself. And if it's a false statement, well, you've just proven that there's truth. You can't empirically prove this, but logic demands it. Now you say, like, okay, well, I'm fine with all that when it comes to tables and stuff, but morals. Well, the same problem persists. You may say that morals can be different from society to society. You know, some societies do A, and some societies would say A is evil. Well, yes, that's fine. That's all well and good when it comes to specific morals. But what is true is that if you say there is no such thing as moral truth, you've made an absolute claim about morals. You've made a moral claim. And thus the same issue of logic obtains. And this is seen so clearly in the fact that, yeah, not all human societies and civilizations have the same set of morals, but they all have morality. They all have notions of right and wrong. So the problem with relativism is that it's just, in my opinion, completely illogical. On the other hand, absolutism, which is the notion that all truth is absolutely the way it is all the time, no matter what, that can be problematic as well. The world is messy, and absolutism can be far too rigid. Sometimes things are not all the way true or all the way false. The world is a complex place. But when we're talking about philosophy and we're talking about the state of truth as such, then relativism appears to be unsalvageable, logically speaking. And we should remember, too, a lot of this relativism logic comes from, or so-called logic, comes from the issue that, well, if nobody agrees, then nobody knows the truth. Well, that's not logically necessary. That doesn't follow. No one can agree and only one person be true, right. Or two people cannot agree and they're both right, somehow. So the presence of controversy or disagreement does not, by any logical necessity, imply the absence of truth. And so if you're going to be a relativist, you really shouldn't do it because nobody agrees. There's got to be deeper implications, deeper reasons why this is the case. But the moment you start reasoning, using logic, the moment you've really stopped being relativistic. And that seems to be the problem with any rejection of truth. Truth does appear to be whatever is the case. And so, for the rest of this semester, while I will not press always, I am a practicing Catholic, so I do believe in God, I do believe in the Bible, but with very, very specific qualifications. I'm not a literalist or a fundamentalist, which we'll discuss more in time, but I do believe that this is the case. Truth exists. And the funny thing is, if a relativist has to admit that everyone is true relative to their own experience or society or whatever, then they have to admit that I have a truth, which is that truth exists. And thus they have to admit that my truth, being that relativism is wrong, is somehow true. So that's where we'll stop. Again, you are welcome to look at the lecture on Does God Exist? And if not, well, then I will run into you next week when we get into what it means to interpret the Bible and then start looking at the first biblical stories. I have really enjoyed this first week, and I am looking forward to more to come. Take care.